Okay. Good morning. It's 9 after 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2021. First, I want to say something, and I don't mean any disrespect, but there is a alarming dissonance in the manner in which the coverage of the Afghan refugees coming to the United States is contrasted with the last 3 years of political brinksmanship regarding refugees at the U.S. Mexico border. I'm concerned because what I'm actually going to talk about identifies a process that has been ongoing for several years. And I'm concerned that the media coverage is revealing something that is alarming and yet not unprecedented, specifically regarding what I understand has been going on in Afghanistan for the last 20 years as part of a form of human bioengineering that is associated with what occurred in Afghanistan that has not been revealed, has not been disclosed or discussed in the United States, including by people who had experience there, and that the importation of these Afghan refugees are connected to processes of on-site verification and or recalibration of whatever was tested and meted out in Afghanistan on actual human beings. With that said, I'm going to move on to what I was discussing earlier, and which is still relevant at this time. In 1986, there were changes to the tax bill in the United States. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 did a number of things, including in that bill were changes to Social Security disability insurance regarding provision of insurance and Social Security benefits to children that had been identified as having certain kinds of disabilities. And this also allowed for an opening of a means by which children, specifically children identified as having a form of disability, were able to access benefits through Medicare and Medicaid. And this has been very important in the matters that ended up following since then. But in so far as that change to the access to Social Security disability insurance occurred, I contend that it was actually very significant. And Social Security is supposed to be something that is paid into for the end of life. But what was going on at that time is that children were accessing a trust that was supposed to and meant to be made available for seniors. I believe that the processes by which that occurred ended up allowing for an ever increasing process of inappropriate pooling or access to benefits that were not generationally appropriate, and also conflated the distinctions in terms of boundaries regarding access by minors to matters and to things that were supposed to be meant for adults. I believe it was intentionally engaged as such. As time has rolled on, there were a number of other factors that occurred, including an understanding that when it comes to billings for Medicare, by law, you have to bill and send in the bill for a session that is billed by Medicare within 6 months of the actual visit. And then after the bill is submitted, there is a period of time where Medicare is by law required to pay for the submission of that bill. After the implementation of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, there was a process, a litigious process, involving whether or not it was constitutional. But in that time, there was already the course of engaging in alleged medical treatment, including for disabilities, including for alleged psychological or mental disabilities associated with mental illness designations, that were billed to Medicare. But the actual submission to Medicare of the billing for those sessions extended the maximum period. And when it came time for Medicare to pay them out, billing records reflect that there was a period of time up to and including 18 months between the initial billing and when it got paid out. Now, there was litigation that was ongoing that ended up delaying the actual implementation of aspects of the Affordable Care Act that would have authorized certain kinds of billings to be processed through and paid out by Medicare. But there was no effort to go through the court process or to engage a litigation process, including a potential temporary legislative process, to authorize an extension on the period of time whereby a session had to be billed after it actually occurred and or it had to be paid by Medicare. This leaves open, as far as I understand, a potential for at least a 6-month period when there were illegal billings and subsequently payments on billings to Medicare. There was at least a 6-month period, if not up to an 18-month period, when there were medical treatments performed, billed to Medicare, and then up to 18 months later, paid from 18 months from the time when they were actually occurred. Technically, by the letter of the law, those were all illegal billings. It was illegal to bill for them, for some of them, because of the duration of time that ended up going into effect between the actual session and when it was billed. But then the duration of time from when it was submitted as a bill and then it was paid by Medicare. There's at least 6 months of Medicare billings that I personally was witness to for myself, but also understanding the context of trends going on with the billing records, at least for the state of California, that were illegal. In 2018, there was a report that as of 2018, there was already a more than 3-year backlog when it came to investigations of Medicare fraud claims. That they had not even started reviewing claims for Medicare fraud that had been submitted within the previous 3 years. This was in the early part of 2017. So by the time COVID-19 came along, there were at least 3 years of backlogs regarding accusations of Medicare fraud that had not been able to have been investigated. Now, one could say a variety of different matters about what that was, money in the budget, all of these different things. But the fact of the matter is by the beginning of 2017, there was a requirement that any entity seeking to do business with the state and to contract with the state, i.e. the federal government, and or through states that were going through federal appropriations process, had to report any accusations of fraud that had been charged to the entity or that were pending for the previous 3 years. However, if you're talking about a more than 3-year backlog of fraud claims that have not even been attempted for investigation, then you get into another situation regarding a almost concept of default. You're not even able to meet the basic standard when it comes to accountability for reporting because you haven't even started the investigation. I contend this was intentionally done. I contend there was intentionally allowed to be a period of time when Medicare billings under the Affordable Care Act were processed knowing that at least for a 6-month period, those billings were illegal. The billing and then the subsequent payment was illegal. It's a 6-month term. A lot can happen in 6 months if you're talking about corporates, securities, for instance, or various things having to do with certain corporate processes. Some initial stock issues take 6 months. It's the equivalent of an entire issue of national stock being 100% illegal. An entire time frame that it is in the works. Those billings were illegal. I contend that it was intentionally done as some form of risk leveraging by virtue of the fact that there was no other bill, including temporary piece of legislation or any sort of court order, to extend the authorization when it came to submitting the billing and or to receiving the payment for the billing that happened concurrently. And that this is not unprecedented. And that, again, it was one of these things where something is tested at one level to see what the reaction is in order to determine if more can be accomplished later along the same ends. I.e., why was there no federal bill authorized through Congress, either submitted or approved by Congress in 2018 to extend protections for federal employees when it came to their employment? The bill and the piece of legislation that authorized compensation and benefits for federal employees expired during the 2018 legislative session. They did not pass another bill. And so far as I understand, until this time, there is no formal legislative authority when it comes to compensation benefits connected to federal workers. I contend that that also was deliberate. And so, for instance, a lot of the budget scenarios that were being wrangled over in public, contestations saying, for instance, that the president was refusing to sign a budget, and as a result of refusing to sign a budget, federal workers were in a precarious situation, was very disingenuous. Because the people that were contesting the president's refusal to sign, for whatever reason, also had not done the work of proposing and passing an actual piece of legislation to give congressional authorization for compensation and benefits associated with federal employees. So these are what I understand to be efforts wherein actions that Congress could have taken, they refused to take. And they had very significant consequences that are at work right now on a very comprehensive level. Now, this is specifically disturbing to me because in 2013, I ended up getting a job as a compliance officer in a public health department where my job was to review the certification processes for practitioners in order for them to be able to bill. In order for a medical practitioner to be able to bill, especially in primary cases I was concerning with had to do with Medicare and or Social Security. There were certain standards that had to be met, including in connection with their credentialing and including with an understanding of their authorization, if nothing else, based upon their absence from an exclusions list. So every month, I was one of a number of people who had a certain allotment of practitioners within the city and county that had to verify to assure that their credentials and their certifications were up to date so that they were authorized to bill. I had to go through more than 2,000 people a month. Now, on a lot of levels, a lot of different things happened with that. But what it showed me was that there, at that time, was at least a process that had at least a year and a half, if not 2 years worth of a track record through the Office of the Inspector General for the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services that had identified what they said were major culprits involved in acts of Medicare fraud. And what I noticed when I was doing research during this time frame is a specific preponderance of certain kinds of characterizations of individuals or entities that were alleged to be involved in Medicare fraud. The primary Medicare fraud of concern for a 2-year period prior to at least November of 2013 had to do with illegal billings to Medicare for diagnoses that would require the prescription of some form of mobility assistance device and or prosthetic medical devices. The primary fraud being targeted and prosecuted was fraud involving medical devices. And unfortunately, there was a very significant ethno-racial distinction or determination in terms of who was targeted and who was allowed to be identified as banned or sanctioned by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. One of the things that I saw that was alarming to me is that a large proportion of people were identified as coming from the countries of the former Soviet Union, specifically the Ukraine and Georgia. And there was also another kind of ethno-national association associated with people from certain Central African countries. Now, at the time, the specifics of this kind of racial or ethnic trend pattern did not make sense to me. I was in an area that had a, proportionally speaking, large community of people who were descendants of the former Soviet Union or the countries of that area relative to the rest of the country overall. But even still, the representation of people nationally that had been sanctioned and the locations, which, by the way, were not primarily in areas that were known to have large populations of people who were descendants of the former Soviet Union, was disproportionate to the actual representation even of the city wherein, and city and county wherein I was working. And so the question then became one of, if in fact there is some sort of large-scale organized crime syndicate that is intentionally defrauding Social Security in order to get medical billings that can then be used to prescribe these kinds of medical devices so that the medical devices can be exported illegally and be made available in the countries of origin, then they cannot do so without very specific and comprehensive accommodation within the United States. that within the United States there must be some comparable process that if not is not actively recruiting them, then is aiding and abetting and facilitating the means by which such a disproportionate representation of crimes associated with defrauding Medicare for medical devices are from the same areas of the world and involve the same kind of crime. Now, this was going on for at least a year and a half to 2 years prior to what was announced in March of 2014 as sanctions that had been put on the Ukraine, specific to the situation in the Crimea. But my concern is that what this is actually discussing, in another manner of speaking, is other things that were ongoing at the time regarding alleged justification for sanctioning specifically Russia, but other countries, the former Soviet Union, that were identified as being non-compliant with mandates around disposal of biological weapons stockpiles. There were numerous reports, including publicly accessible, including in connection with public hearings or public committee meetings through Congress, that discussed how, as part of the decommissioning of the Soviet Union, there had been an agreement to address certain stockpiles within the former Soviet Union of biological weapons, but also that there were a number of people that were identified as being biological weapons specialists. And the concern was that with the decommissioning of the Soviet Union and with the precariousness of the financial sector, or the financial status of the sectors involved in those weapons paradigms, and with other things associated with the transition in the military, that there would be a greater propensity for an attempt to lure or entice people that had that kind of experience into participation in sectors that would involve illegal or illicit activities, up to and including illegal or illicit activities involving their expertise with biological weapons. But I contend that there's actually something more comprehensive that occurred, and that it actually speaks very significantly to the contemporary moment we're in right now. And I think that there is a very serious distinction between what the United States associated with and tried to promote as a particular kind of biomed technology or concept of healthcare that had a different conceptualization within a context associated with the manners in which the former Soviet Union identified its biomed sector and or its understanding of what was capable or possible, as well as the national security implications of healthcare or medicine. And that in an attempt to try to enculturate a specific kind of understanding of the biomed sector into the decommissioning of the Soviet Union, that what could potentially have been identified in another manner got collapsed into a specific kind of designation as biological weapon. And for instance, in the United States, if you were at any point in the last 10 years involved in actual emergency preparedness and prevention regarding things having to do with, for instance, a natural disaster or any sort of healthcare response, including public healthcare response to a terrorist attack, and you understand that there are already procedures around how to deal with chemical weapons exposure or exposure to particular kinds of bioagents, including toxins or viruses or other things that would be associated with or identified as biological agents. But the characterization of a biological weapon, I contend, has a different context within the United States that has not been thoroughly examined and has not been thoroughly engaged in public education. And the things that otherwise would have a different characterization here actually qualify as a form of potential or component material of biological weapon, if not an actual biological weapon in capacity for deployment if it's misused. And so what we've been having in the United States is a refusal to discuss, for instance, how things like our vaccination program or programs associated with immunizations also involve being connected to stockpiling, that also includes stockpiling associated presumably with research on how to counter a biological weapons attack that is itself based on stockpiles and storehouses of actual biological weapons, actual viruses, actual agents that can be deployed in some kind of weaponization attack. And so there's this disconnect in terms of what the United States identified specifically and explicitly as a biological weapon and what you do with it versus what was being demanded of a presumption of or a particular characterization of an entire biological weapons paradigm, including people associated with the development or the analysis of biological weapons, which in the United States would be characterized as what? What do we call a biological weapons specialist in the United States? Do we call them an immunobiologist? Do we call them a virologist? And so this kind of situation, I contend, created a double standard, which was behind the refusal of Russia to renew the Memorandum of Understanding that the United States and Russia had up through the onset of the Affordable Care Act. And so a lot of the sanctions and a lot of the punitive characterization that has been going on in certain elements has been about this. So then this brings up this consideration of these medical devices. Were these medical devices actually a part of some sort of clandestine or rather undisclosed process concerning cybernetics in the United States that itself may be associated with now what tries to purport itself to be robotics? In the last 2 years, there has been specifically, but especially going back to 2016, 2017, there has been this attempt to try to glamorize or rather promote this understanding of the role of robotics as if it has all of this social utility, including in a situation wherein it is being promoted as an endeavor that is supposed to be desirable for young people to engage, without putting it in a context, including a historical context of its relationship to aspects of the biomed sector that may be predicated upon prior understanding of biological technologies or biomedical technologies, and what does it mean to discuss those processes whereby actual mechanics engages with the biology. Who actually develops these robotics programs? Was it based upon accusations, for instance, that people had been involved in MediCare fraud because they were illegally, to the letter of the law, acquiring medical devices? And so then the question becomes, well, who was it that they were identifying as being the recipients of these medical devices? And what happened to those people that were victimized by that exploitation? And this gets us into another realm that has not been talked about. And I'm finding a very significant resistance to discussions on these matters, especially now during this time of COVID-19, which is my concern that what has been happening is that in this specific paradigm where we are focusing on genetic information alienated from it actually being biological materials and biological property of actual human beings, that it is being assessed both a qualitative and quantitative value that other people are claiming as some form of product. And insofar as they are acquiring our biological property, they are then making us and our bodies and that which is derived from our bodies their property. And they are selling it and trading it and expecting us to acclimate and adjust to their market demand for our biological property without even acknowledging it as such. And then the question becomes, at what point do they separate their concept of their ownership of our biological property from our actual literal bodies and what our bodies do, up to and including our intellectual property or the actual body and our movement of bodies in actual areas and in actual performance of what it is that we want to be doing. And the concern in so far as I have right now is that we are in a situation where people are using specific racial indicators or genetic indicators based upon some sort of analysis of actual DNA as a form of property that has a particular kind of value that is being leveraged, including through redistribution as a form of equity. And so these discussions about restitution or even reparations for historical injustice are predicated upon a eugenicist perspective of a particular racial archetype, as opposed to dealing responsibly with histories of political retaliation that also have to deal with the dispossession of people's political rights based upon the engagement of racist or eugenicist paradigms. And so what is happening is there is an intentional effort to dispossess us of our political lineages. And part of the justification is by identifying people within certain political lineages that have certain kinds of genetic property, and then allowing for people who have been able to acquire some kind of property stake at a certain proportion associated with the genetic property to then claim the political lineage as their own and cleanse it or sanitize it of any political impropriety. And the primary means by which they're doing this is to racially engineer acceptable political paradigms. And if you do not comport yourself in accordance with an acceptable political paradigm, then you are racially reassigned. You are racially reprogrammed. And that this is evidenced as an intentional paradigmatic experience is so far as one understands the intersection of the sort of realm of cybernetics, the intentional mischaracterization of different political paradigms around understanding biology and alleged medicine, including in a capacity associated with weaponization, and the accusations of MediCare fraud, which then brings up the contemporary context of the political paradigm, identifying Medicare for all as a political right, as opposed to talking about actual constitutional rights, including property rights, including rights to be safe in our person and property, with an explicit understanding that we are our own property, that the parts of our body are our actual property. So when you acquire our property, presumably to provide medical treatment, there are certain expectations that should be understood in terms of adhering to the Constitution about what you do with that and what you feel you're entitled to do with that. Unfortunately, this has not been presented. And not only has this not been presented, it has not been allowed to have political expression. We are not allowed in this country right now to have a political identity about what we want to have done with our genetic property, with our biological property, with our actual bodies. They have made the components of our bodies somebody else's property. And somebody else is supposed to be allowed to make determinations about where our bodies are allowed to go. And I contend that this calls the question on who thinks they're entitled to own another person's body. Because by the letter of the law, that's slavery. That's slavery. And slavery is unconstitutional. Slavery is unconstitutional in the United States, and there's no way, regardless of where you're born or what your blood quanta is, in relation to somebody's understanding of demographic representation of a particular political paradigm, that anybody else should be able to own it and then tell you because they own it, you got to do what they say. Because this is also, unfortunately, a part of certain kinds of lineages. Lineages of ethnic cleansing. Lineages of political disappearance. You know, when you allow for this kind of paradigm to play out, we're not talking about claiming an inheritance, and we're not talking about reparations for racism. What we're talking about is allowing yourself to be identified in lineage with specific political movements that used eugenics as a justification for stifling, quashing, and eradicating certain kinds of political dissent, including political dissent by people who were founders of political movements that were intentionally removed and dispossessed from their contributions to those political movements because somebody else did not find it opportune to acknowledge their dissent, to acknowledge their criticism of somebody else's sense of entitlement. And the primary means by which this historically has broken down is, are you willing to make somebody else your slave to accomplish your political agenda? Are you willing to knowingly and willingly engage in crime so as to make somebody else a piece of property that you leverage to accomplish your political objectives? If you don't like the term slavery because you understand yourself to have a different kind of political nuance, then understand it from this context. Your political colleague has a disagreement. you have the option of having them put into a situation where they are dispossessed of their contributions, including their intellectual property contributions, because you can have them designated as a threat. And what they produce is a threat, including a threat to your safety, including a threat to your mental health. And rather than dealing with it from an understanding that they have actually broken laws and prosecuting them, you have them declared as having a mental illness. And so now they're sick and they need to be treated. And in the course of being sick and treated, they need medicine. And if they don't take their medicine, then they're determined to not be compliant. And in the course of not being compliant, they're unsafe. So they can be dispossessed. What do you do with them then? What are you going to do with the sick people? If somebody does not have the mental capacity to make an informed decision about their own life, do you have the right to buy and sell their property for them? Do you have the right to buy and sell their futures for them or on their behalf? I contend you do not. And if you do, or rather, if you continue to, then you've identified yourself in a political lineage. It's not about your racial equity. It's not about genetic disposition or some sort of genetic indicator that has put you in a context of oppression. It's about the content of your character. And it has to be your character.